The Zal'garoth Empire had never known failure. Across the spiral arms of the galaxy, their fleets descended upon civilizations with calculated brutality, burning entire histories to ash before absorbing whatever remained. Their empire spanned 1,000 systems, each world a monument to conquest. When their warlords set their sights on Earth, it was not out of necessity nor strategy. It was habit. General Korakthal observed the pale blue planet from the bridge of his command vessel, the Void-born Dominance. A creature of scaled obsidian and coiled muscle, he stood at the helm like a living relic of war, his 6-clawed fingers resting on the holographic display before him. The tactical feeds showed orbital superiority had already been established. Earth's primitive defenses had been obliterated in the first wave, their satellites reduced to drifting slag. Cities burned in the wake of precision bombardments. Terran resistance forces, though surprisingly tenacious, were scattered. Their technology was laughably crude, their species biologically inferior to the warrior-born Zal'garoth. "Proceed with Phase 2, Korakthal commanded, his voice a guttural rasp that carried across the bridge. On his order, transport ships descended, unleashing shock troopers to secure key locations. Major population centers were occupied within hours, humanity's leaders either captured or slaughtered. The Empire's methods were efficient. Resistance was crushed early before it had time to take root. Surrender followed as a formality. Yet something unsettled him. Unlike previous conquests, Earth did not crumble with whimpering submission. Yes, their weapons were ineffective, their attempts at counteroffensives laughable. But there was a defiance in their eyes, a fire that did not dim even when everything around them turned to ruin. The human soldiers fought with an unpredictability that troubled his strategists. Their retreat patterns were erratic, their ambushes executed with a savagery that defied the cold calculations of war doctrine. Even captured, many refused to bow. Korakthal paced, his heavy footfalls echoing across the bridge's war-steel flooring. His thoughts lingered on one particular group taken in the last sweep. Unlike the broken prisoners already sent for processing, these men had not succumbed to fear. He had seen them standing in the dim-lit confines of the detention hold, their bodies marked with wounds, but their gazes steady. One of them, an older male, had actually laughed when his guards dragged him forward. Korakthal did not understand laughter. On Earth, beneath the fractured remains of what had once been a fortified military outpost, Gunnery Sergeant Jackson Briggs sat with his back against the cold steel wall of his cell, arms resting over his knees. He had been in this hole for 3 days, maybe 4, not that he particularly cared. Time had a way of stretching and folding in places like this. He had been through worse. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. His captors had tried to break him in the usual ways: deprivation, isolation, intimidation. Child's play. Briggs had been a Marine drill instructor for over 2 decades, forged in fire and discipline. He had seen fresh recruits pushed to the brink of their endurance, had listened to the broken gasps of men who thought they'd reached their limits, only to push them further. Pain and hardship were just parts of the process. He knew the mind bent long before the body did. And he wasn't the one bending. Boots echoed down the corridor. The thick door to his cell hissed open, flooding the chamber with a dim green light. 2 Zal'garoth warriors entered, their towering forms framed by the glow. One leveled a weapon at his chest, the other gestured sharply. Briggs remained seated, regarding them with mild interest. "On your feet," the alien growled in heavily accented English. Briggs grinned. "Say please." The Zal'garoth stepped forward, jabbing the barrel of his weapon toward Briggs' sternum. Faster than the alien could react, Briggs snatched the barrel with one hand, twisted sharply, and sent the warrior staggering. The second guard lunged, but Briggs was already moving, driving an elbow into the creature's throat. The alien crumpled, choking on its own breath. More boots thundered outside. A third Zal'garoth stormed in, leveling a stun baton at Briggs' ribs. Electricity arced through his body, dropping him to one knee. He clenched his jaw against the pain, tasting iron as his muscles seized. "Enough," a cold voice rasped. The guard stepped back. Briggs lifted his head, blinking away the static haze. The new figure standing in the doorway was different. His armor gleamed with the dark luster of command, the sharp angles of his face betraying an intelligence beyond the blunt violence of the rank and file. "Gunnery Sergeant Jackson Briggs," the figure mused, stepping into the cell. "I have reviewed your record. Your people speak of you as if you are more than just a soldier." Briggs spat blood onto the floor, smirking. "Guess that depends on who you ask." The Zal'garoth tilted his head, studying him as though observing an anomaly. "Your world is lost. Your military is shattered. Yet you do not beg. You do not submit. Briggs flexed his fingers, shaking off the last tremors of the stun charge. You don't know much about Marines, do you? The Zal'garoth's expression remained unreadable. I know many things. I know how wars are won before they even begin. I know how civilizations crumble under the weight of inevitability. And I know how men break when they realize resistance is meaningless. Briggs exhaled sharply through his nose. That's where you screwed up, pal? You think this is just another conquest? He shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders. But you don't know jack about humans. The Zal'garoth's eyes narrowed. Enlighten me. Briggs leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with iron. You ever been through boot camp? Ever been screamed at till your ears bled, run till your lungs caught fire, pushed past everything you thought you could endure? He gestured around the cell. This ain't suffering. This ain't even close. He jabbed a finger at the alien's chest. You think you're breaking me? Buddy, I've been broken and rebuilt 100 times over. That's what we do. That's what makes us dangerous. We don't quit. We don't back down. Silence stretched between them. For the first time in his long career of war, General Corkthal felt something resembling uncertainty. He had seen bravery before, foolish, desperate attempts to stand against the inevitable. But this was different. This was not the empty bravado of a doomed man. This was something primal, something the Zal'garoth did not understand. Something they feared. Briggs rolled his neck, the crack of vertebrae filling the silence. Now, are we gonna stand here measuring egos, or are you actually gonna do something? Corkthal's jaw tightened. He turned sharply. Bring him. The guards seized Briggs by the arms, dragging him from the cell. He didn't fight. Not yet. Briggs was hauled through dimly lit corridors, the Zal'garoth guards gripping his arms with an unnecessary force that spoke more of frustration than necessity. He let them drag him, conserving his strength, his mind working through the situation. He had been in tight spots before, but this was a whole new level of deep. He was inside an alien warship, surrounded by an empire that had never known defeat. Any reasonable man would have resigned himself to fate. But Briggs had never been reasonable. The doors ahead slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a vast chamber lined with jagged black metal. At the center, a raised platform held an ominous-looking chair with restraints. Instruments of alien design surrounded it, pulsing with unreadable displays. He didn't need a translation to know what they were for. The guards forced him forward, shoving him onto the chair. Cold restraints snapped around his wrists and ankles, locking him in place. He tested them with a flex of his muscles, feeling the strength of the material. Not unbreakable but close. Corkthal stepped into view, hands clasped behind his back. His armor gleamed under the sterile light, the deep etchings on its surface marking him as a high-ranking warlord. His reptilian gaze fixed on Briggs, unreadable yet intent. You fascinate me, human, Corkthal said at last. Your species, your kind should have broken by now. And yet, there remains something stubborn in you. Briggs smirked. Yeah, we get that a lot. Corkthal gestured, and a technician in a sleek, dark uniform approached, adjusting controls on a nearby console. A low hum filled the air. We do not need to break your body, the warlord continued. That is crude. Inefficient. We will break your mind instead. Strip away your resistance layer by layer until only submission remains. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. Man, you aliens just don't get it. Corkthal's eyes narrowed. Enlighten me. Briggs tilted his head back, exhaling through his nose. You're looking at this all wrong. You think you can beat me down, wear me out, make me give up? Buddy, I spent 20 years breaking recruits tougher than you. You think I haven't seen men on the verge of quitting? Seen that hollow look in their eyes when they think they can't push anymore? You know what happens next. He grinned, teeth stained with dried blood. They go one step further. And then another. Because we teach them that pain ain't the end. It's just the next obstacle. Corkthal studied him, then gave a curt nod. The technician activated the device. Agony tore through Briggs' skull. White-hot, searing like a drill burrowing into his thoughts. He clenched his jaw, breathing through the pain. He recognized the method. Some kind of neural invasion digging into his mind, stripping away defenses. They wanted to unravel him, leave him raw and exposed. But pain wasn't new to him. He had been 22 the first time he felt true pain, running on burning lungs, legs shaking, stomach cramping from exhaustion. His drill instructor screaming in his ear, his mind begging for it to stop. But he didn't stop. He pushed forward. Because that was the only way through. The memory flashed, unbidden, and he latched onto it. Held it tight. Let the pain become background noise. The machine whined louder. Corkthal watched. Briggs laughed. The Zal'garoth general's brow furrowed slightly. You mock your own suffering? Briggs exhaled, shaking off the lingering burn. Nah. I just think it's funny how much effort you're wasting. The machine powered down. The technician hesitated, looking at Corkthal with uncertainty. The general's expression darkened. This is not possible, the alien muttered. Briggs rolled his neck, the crack of vertebrae breaking the silence. You want to know what the difference is between you and me? Corkthal didn't answer. You were born into strength. Trained from the start to be bigger, meaner, tougher. You think that makes you superior. But I've trained men who weren't the strongest, who weren't the fastest. And I've watched them outlast guys twice their size because it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you get hit and keep moving forward. Corkthal turned away, pacing. You believe your will is stronger than an empire? Briggs' grin faded. I believe you just lost the second you started asking that question. Silence. Then, without a word, Corkthal gestured to the guards. The restraints snapped open and Briggs was hauled to his feet. The general leaned in, voice low. We are not finished. Briggs smirked. I figured. The guards dragged him back to his cell. The door slammed shut behind him. He stretched, rolling out the stiffness in his muscles, then sat back against the wall. They had thrown their worst at him and he was still standing. That meant he had time. Time to observe, time to think. Time to plan. Briggs sat in the dim confines of his cell, his back pressed against the cold metal wall, eyes half-lidded but far from tired. His body ached, but it was a familiar ache, the kind he welcomed. Pain meant he was still alive, and being alive meant he still had a fight ahead of him. The Zal'garoth thought they were breaking him down, but they were doing the exact opposite. Every failed attempt to crush his will only reinforced the truth. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. They weren't just fighting a man. They were fighting everything that had made him. Every hardship, every lesson, every goddamn drill he had ever screamed into the ears of recruits who thought they had nothing left to give. He took a slow breath, flexing his fingers. He needed more information. His mind ran over everything he had seen since his capture. The hallways, the layout, the guards' patterns. Everything about the Zal'garoth was efficient but predictable. That was a weakness. Predictability meant he could anticipate, and anticipation meant control. The door to his cell slid open with a sharp hiss. 2 Zal'garoth guards stood there, their sleek black armor absorbing the dim light. One gestured with a weapon. Move. Briggs grinned, pushing himself to his feet with deliberate slowness. You fellas miss me already? Neither answered. He was marched down a series of corridors, past rows of sealed cells where other humans were likely being held. He noted everything, the placement of cameras, the number of guards, the way the security doors operated. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a soldier gathering intel. Eventually, they entered a vast chamber unlike any he had seen before. The walls were lined with sleek consoles, alien text scrolling across the displays. At the center, a massive holographic projection of a star map flickered, planets marked with glowing symbols. Corkthal stood at the head of the room, his arms folded behind his back, his posture as rigid as ever. Briggs was shoved forward. He barely stumbled. The general regarded him in silence for a long moment before speaking. You intrigue me, human. Briggs smirked. I get that a lot. Corkthal's claws flexed at his sides. You have endured more than any other prisoner. No matter what is done to you, you resist. You mock. You refuse to accept what is inevitable. He gestured toward the holographic display. This is your planet. Conquered. Subjugated. Your kind fights, but they cannot win. Every world we have ever taken has bowed before our might. Briggs shrugged. Maybe that's your problem. Corkthal's brow furrowed. Explain. Briggs stepped forward, unafraid. You're used to things going one way. You show up, you knock over the first line of defense and everyone just rolls over. That's not how this works with humans. He pointed a finger at the display. You think Earth's lost because you're standing on it? But what you don't get is that wars aren't won with territory. They're won with will. And buddy, you just kicked the hornet's nest. The general's eyes narrowed. You believe your people can win? Briggs grinned. I don't believe. I know. Corkthal studied him for a long moment, then turned to one of the guards. Bring him. Briggs was led through another series of hallways, deeper into the ship, until they reached a massive training chamber. Inside, Zal'garoth soldiers moved with disciplined precision, drilling with weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Their formations were perfect, their coordination flawless. It was a display of strength meant to intimidate him. Briggs barely suppressed a yawn. Corkthal stepped beside him. These are warriors bred for battle. They do not tire. They do not hesitate. They do not falter. Briggs cracked his knuckles. They ever fight someone who hits back? The general gestured, and one of the Zal'garoth soldiers stepped forward. The alien was massive, its scaled armor reflecting the overhead lights. It carried no weapon. It didn't need one. Briggs grinned. Oh, this is gonna be fun. The Zal'garoth lunged. Briggs sidestepped at the last second, letting the alien's momentum carry it forward. He drove an elbow into the creature's side, a calculated strike just below the ribs. The alien stumbled but didn't go down. It spun, faster than its size suggested, and threw a massive fist toward Briggs' head. He ducked, felt the wind of the strike pass over him, and drove a boot into the alien's knee. The Zal'garoth staggered, and that was all he needed. He followed up with a brutal uppercut to the jaw, sending the warrior crashing to the ground. Silence filled the chamber. Briggs turned to Corkthal and dusted off his hands. Any more? The general's gaze was unreadable. You fight differently than we do. Briggs rolled his shoulders. Yeah, because we actually fight. He gestured to the fallen warrior. Your guys? They fight like they've never been punched in the mouth before. Corkthal's jaw tightened. Briggs took a step closer. You want to know why you keep losing to me? Because you think strength is about muscle and tech. But real strength. He tapped his temple. It's up here. And I got plenty more where that came from. For the first time, Corkthal looked uncertain. Briggs smiled. The cracks were forming. And cracks, if you knew how to work them, could bring down empires. Briggs stood in the center of the training chamber, rolling his shoulders as the fallen Zal'garoth warrior groaned on the floor. Around him, the other aliens watched in silence. Some looked furious, others confused, but more than a few had something else behind their reptilian eyes, something Briggs had seen in young recruits who had just taken their first real hit. Doubt. Corkthal had not spoken for nearly a full minute. That alone told Briggs everything he needed to know. The general was processing, recalculating. He had brought Briggs here to prove a point, to show him that resistance was futile. Instead, he had witnessed his prized warriors humiliated by a battered, unarmed human. Briggs smiled. He had seen that expression before too. Corkthal turned to his soldiers, his deep voice cold and sharp. Leave us. The Zal'garoth hesitated. Their instincts told them to obey, but there was something else now. A shift in the air, a moment where they saw their leader question himself. The hesitation only lasted a second, but Briggs noticed. Corkthal did too. His fists clenched and his voice came harder this time. Now. The room emptied, warriors filing out in silence, leaving only Briggs and the general standing amidst the vast chamber. Corkthal finally turned, his golden eyes locking onto Briggs with an intensity that would have made a lesser man shrink. You believe you have won something here? The general said slowly. Briggs smirked. You're the one who just cleared the room, pal? Corkthal exhaled sharply through his nostrils. You think you have exposed weakness in my kind. That our strength is fragile because of how we were raised, how we were bred. His claws flexed, tapping lightly against the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his waist. But what you fail to understand is that strength is not only in the body. It is in the will. And my will is absolute. Briggs tilted his head. That a fact. In one fluid motion, Corkthal drew his blade and lunged. Briggs barely had time to react, twisting just enough to avoid the initial slash. The air hissed as the blade cut through where his throat had been a second ago. He pivoted, bringing up an arm to deflect the follow-up strike, but Corkthal was fast, faster than his soldiers. The blade sliced across Briggs' forearm, leaving a shallow but burning wound. Briggs gritted his teeth, stepped inside the alien's guard, and slammed a fist into his ribs. Corkthal barely flinched. The general drove a knee into Briggs' stomach, sending him staggering back. Briggs wiped blood from his lip, grinning. That all you got? Corkthal lunged again. This time Briggs didn't retreat. He stepped forward inside the arc of the blade and grabbed the warlord's wrist. With a sharp twist, he forced the blade downward, redirecting the strike into the floor. Sparks flew as metal scraped against metal. Before Corkthal could recover, Briggs drove an elbow into his jaw, then another into his gut. The general stumbled. Briggs pressed the advantage. He struck fast, brutal, relentless, driving Corkthal backward with every blow. He could feel the shift happening. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was proof. One final strike, a savage uppercut, sent Corkthal crashing to his knees. The general braced himself on one hand, his breathing heavy, blood trickling from a split lip. His blade lay inches away, but he made no move to reach for it. Briggs stepped closer, towering over him. You see it now, don't you? Korakthal's claws dug into the floor. His entire frame trembled, not from pain but from something deeper. His golden eyes, always filled with cold certainty, now flickered with something dangerously close to doubt. Briggs knelt beside him. Your empire? It ain't invincible. Your soldiers? They ain't unbreakable. And you? He leaned in, voice calm but razor sharp. You just lost in front of your own men. Silence hung between them. The only sound was the distant hum of the warship's engines. Then Korakthal did something Briggs hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a low, rasping sound, filled with something bitter and almost relieved. He slowly pushed himself upright, his towering frame still impressive even as he wiped the blood from his mouth. When he looked at Briggs again, there was something new in his eyes. Not anger. Not hatred. Understanding. You are dangerous, Korakthal admitted. Briggs chuckled. Yeah, I get that a lot too. The general exhaled, then nodded. Just once. And the Zal'garoth Empire would never be the same.